Financial Services and General Government will come to order. I'd like to welcome Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina. I appreciate your participation in today's hearing to give the members of the subcommittee the opportunity to discuss your Federal Trade Commission's fiscal year 2025 budget request and conduct oversight over the commission. In my new role as the chairman, I'm eager to work with all the members of the subcommittees and all of the agency heads under our jurisdiction as we work to fund the government in a timely, responsible way for the fiscal year 2025. I also look forward to conducting oversight of the agencies under our jurisdiction, including the FTC. It is for these purposes that we are gathered here to hear testimony and ask questions today. The fiscal year 2025 budget request for the Federal Trade Commission is $535 million. That would be a nearly 35% plus up from the fiscal year's 2024 enacted levels. Although funding for the FTC is partially offset by fees, the Commission's fiscal year 2025 proposed budget is once again a request for a dramatic increase in funding for an agency whose work continues to raise concern among many members of Congress and the public, including individuals, families, and businesses in Ohio's 14th Congressional District, where I represent. Now, I'll be honest, it'll be difficult to support a 35% increase at the FTC or any agency under our jurisdiction. Current government spending levels are unsustainable. We have seen record deficits in recent years, in part due to COVID, and we have to reduce our spending. Under this administration, the FTC has prioritized the issuance of many polarizing regulations that push the legal boundaries of the Commission's mission as established by Congress. While the FTC has the responsibility alongside the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice to promote competition, it also bears the responsibility to do so in a way that respects the rule of law and due process. It must ensure that its regulations are well developed and accurately evaluated before their issuance. Yet, over the last several years, there have been repeated instances of rulemaking while purporting to benefit consumers and competition clearly exceed the statutory authority. Some of these rules, such as the recently issued rule on non-competes, could be well-intentioned, but in reality, it goes too far and has the potential to stifle economic growth. Other rules, such as the CARS rule, claim to protect consumers, but the rule lacks a clear justification and adds unnecessary burdens to consumers. Even the FTC decided to pump the brakes on this rule while a legal challenge against it is pending. Similarly, last summer, the FTC proposed changes to the pre-merger filing forms and notifications. As you know, fees from those forms fund much of FTC's work. I'm concerned that the burden with this new proposal will have on businesses. By the Commission's own estimates, under the new rules, the time required for each filing will rise from the average of 37 hours to an average of 144 hours. The FTC expects some filings may take 222 hours to prepare. With such large-scale filings will be likely managed by larger corporations that have a support of experienced attorneys, it is inevitable that some of the increased burden will also apply to small businesses and startups. The constitutional statutory foundation for these and other rules that the Commission has issued is severely lacking, and I look forward to discussing that further today. While I expect that much of the dialogue today will focus on the work produced by the FTC, I'm also concerned with the work environment within it. Shortly after the change in leadership at FTC, staff reported their lack of trust in senior leadership's honesty and integrity at an alarming level. Reports also indicated that senior leaders did not generate high levels of motivation or commitment in the workforce. While those surveys have shown that some improvement in 2023, is my expectation that the chair and all those working at senior levels of the FTC will continue to take necessary steps towards promoting and demonstrating workplace integrity. Particularly within an agency tasked with combating deception, honesty should be a core pillar. The subcommittee has a jurisdiction over the federal workforce, and with that in mind, I will remain watchful of the levels of employee satisfaction and trust within the FTC. I look forward to today's dialogue to discuss these topics and other pertinent topics. I now turn this over to my friend and ranking member, Mr. Hoyer, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. And welcome, Ms. Khan, to the hearing room, and thank you very much for your service to our country. Promoting competition, from my perspective, was central to some of the historic bills we enacted last Congress, from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to the CHIPS and Science Act to the Inflation Reduction Act. We all want competition. Those of us who are supportive of the free market know that competition is absolutely essential to keep it free and to keep it a market. We want growth and we want development, which come with it. Justice Brandeis once cautioned, however, that unless there be regulation of competition, its excesses will lead to the destruction of that very competition. That's the goal of the FTC, of course, to promote fair competition and to protect American consumers. We've seen the detrimental effects of anti-competitive business practice on American consumers just recently. Whether it's the grocery store or at the pump, many families have had to contend with higher prices. Recent inflation is largely a product of the COVID-19 pandemic, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and other disruptions to the global economy. But anti-competitive business tactics have also played a role. The oil cartel is a specific example of that. Recent FTC reports have found that there has been a lot of consolidation among grocery stores and supermarket chains, which I know in my own community to be the case, which has allowed their profit margins to grow even higher than before the pandemic at the expense of the American consumer. They can charge their customers a whole lot more than those customers don't have anywhere else to shop. FTC research has also found similar trends in the meatpacking industry, with monopolies driving up grocery prices to turn a larger profit. Oil and gas companies, which I mentioned, have also engaged in price gouging, raking in record profits despite many Americans struggling to afford to refill their tanks to get to schools, to get to work, to get to recreation. The FTC is also playing a leading role in ensuring that healthcare services nationwide are affordable, accessible, and of high quality by closely scrutinizing mergers, both vertical and horizontal, throughout the industry. Although inflation continues to go down and our economy continues to outcompete our G7 peers, we need to keep working to bring down costs even further. The FTC is crucial, in my opinion, to that effort by helping promote competition. The FTC is also vital to protecting American consumers. Rules help defend Americans against everything from scam calls to the healthcare data breaches. A few weeks ago, for example, the FTC issued a rule banning non-compete clauses. That means that if you're flipping burgers for a fast food chain, your employer can't prevent you from going to work for another restaurant across the street if it's offering better wages. The FTC needs federal funding to conduct this essential work. That's why I strongly support the FTC's fiscal year 2025 request of $535 million, which is partially offset, of course, by fees. Enforcement is a critically important effort in anything in life. If you don't have a referee on the field, people break the rules, and the game is not played fairly. That's essentially what you do. If you're opposed to these predatory business practices, most Americans are, then you ought to support this funding. If you believe, as I do, that capitalism depends on fair competition, as I said earlier, then work with us to fulfill the FTC's request. Thank you again to Chair Khan for joining us, and I look forward to hearing why these resources are so crucial to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoyer, and I will now recognize my friend and the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. DeLauro, for any comments she might have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to say thank you to you and to Ranking Member Hoyer for holding this hearing, and a thank you to Chairwoman Khan for being here today. But so much thanks for your public service, for your dedication to protecting American consumers from anti-competitive and unfair business practices across our country, across our economy. Your agency is critical in combating the corporate greed that has led to the biggest companies making record profits at a time when hard-working Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They struggle to make ends meet while facing exorbitant price increases on things that they buy every day. All the while, corporations are taking every opportunity to expand their power through mergers, acquisitions of both competitors and suppliers, tightening their grip on everything from grocery aisles to gas pumps and solidifying their ability to raise prices on a whim. There is no food shortage in the United States. There is no reason for the exorbitant prices. They do it because they can. While inflation has cooled from its peak, there is still much to be done to lower the cost of living, make the economy work for more people, and your agency has a critical role to play in that effort. Just recently, The Federal Trade Commission expanded economic freedom for all Americans by banning non-compete contract clauses nationwide, allowing workers to seek the compensation they are worth on the open market without being handcuffed by employers. This action alone will put an estimated $524 in the average worker's pocket annually, will lower health care costs by nearly $200 billion over the next decade, and lead to 8,500 new businesses every year. I also applaud your agency's recent report highlighting the hyper-consolidation of the U.S. infant formula market. I look forward to working with you to address the industry's fragility and to build a more diverse and resilient infant formula market. And at the beginning of this month, you uncovered disturbing evidence of a big oil executive colluding with the OPEC to inflate oil prices, leading to pain at the gas pump and at the airport for millions of American families, all for the sake of higher profits. This right here is exactly what we mean when we talk about corporate greed driving inflation. Big energy companies would rather collude with a cartel of authoritarian states than let the free market truly determine the price at the pump. And we do not have a shortage of gasoline and oil. It's no shortage. It's shameless profiteering at every opportunity that shows why we must do everything that we can to support the FTC. In last year's bill, House Democrats defeated a Republican poison pill rider that would have tied the commission's hands and allowed for expensive add-on fees at car dealerships. Soaring new and used car prices have been a painful driver of inflation, and the majority's measure would have made it easier for dealerships to bait and switch, price gouge consumers with junk fees. I'm delighted we defeated this wrong-headed rider, but we have much more to do. To help ensure fairness across the economy, to protect consumers, the FTC must have the resources it needs to support its staff, infrastructure, and litigation efforts. And President Biden's request for a 26% budget increase would enable just that. The FTC is up against the full might of American corporations and their expansive legal teams, so we must ensure the Commission has the capacity to take on this mission in full and fight back on behalf of the American consumers. Many thanks to you for appearing before the subcommittee and for your public service to our country. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. DeLauro. Chair Khan, you will, without objection, your full written testimony will be entered into the record. With that in mind, I ask you to please summarize your opening statement in 5 minutes.
Good morning, everybody. Chairman Joyce, Ranking Member Hoyer, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today. Chairman Joyce, congratulations on your appointment as chair, and I look forward to working together. I'm happy to share with you all some of the critical work that the Federal Trade Commission has advanced this past year and to discuss with you the Commission's budget request for fiscal year 2025. For every $1 that the FTC receives in funding, we provide $14 in benefits to the public. For the American people, there is no doubt that resourcing the FTC is an excellent return on investment. Of course, none of this work would be possible without the talented and dedicated staff of the FTC, whose hard work and fidelity to the FTC's mission protect Americans' pocketbooks, privacy, and economic liberty. As American families continue to struggle with higher prices for daily necessities, the FTC's work helps ensure that Americans keep more of their paychecks. By protecting fair competition and preventing unlawful business practices, our work improves families' bottom lines and lowers costs, be it at the grocery store, the pharmacy counter, or the gas pump. As part of that work, the FTC has initiated the largest crackdown on illegal telemarketing in our history, and consumer complaints have plummeted nearly 60% since 2021. As AI turbocharges scams, we're shutting down fraud affecting older Americans, veterans, and other underserved populations, including those recovering from opioid addiction. The Commission is bringing all of its tools to bear to protect Americans' privacy. Over the last year, we have taken on unscrupulous data brokers and issued bans on firms who exploit or endanger people's sensitive health or geolocation data, including by selling it to entities in China. We've also proposed a rule to strengthen kids' privacy online and to limit companies' ability to sell kids' data for profit. The Commission has issued rules to address some of the most widespread consumer scams. We proposed a rule to protect Americans from hidden, deceptive junk fees that cheat them out of tens of billions of dollars each year, and finalized a rule requiring clear upfront pricing for cars, one of the biggest purchases that Americans make. We proposed a click-to-cancel rule that will make it as easy to cancel a subscription as it is to sign up for one, freeing people from subscription traps. And we finalized a rule to protect Americans from government and business impersonation scams, which are becoming ever more sophisticated with the adoption of AI. We have been just as active in our competition work. Earlier this year, we challenged Kroger's acquisition of Albertsons, the largest supermarket merger in U.S. history, because, as our complaint alleges, we believed it would lead to higher grocery prices for millions of Americans. When we investigated Exxon's proposed merger with Pioneer, we found evidence that Pioneer's former CEO attempted to organize anti-competitive coordinated output reductions between U.S. oil producers and OPEC+, potential collusion that could contribute to Americans paying more for gas. We also sued U.S. anesthesia partners for monopolizing anesthesiology services in Texas, a private equity-driven scheme that costs Texans tens of millions of dollars a year. We are paying close attention to anti-competitive practices that harm American consumers, workers, and our economy. In September, the Commission and a bipartisan group of 17 state attorneys general filed a lawsuit against Amazon, alleging that it is engaged in monopolistic conduct that inflate costs for families and businesses. We are also continuing to litigate a monopolization case against Facebook, brought by my predecessor during the Trump administration. We have challenged improper patents listed by pharmaceutical companies, prompting several to take down these junk listings and open up the market to free competition. Because of the FTC's work, 3 of the 4 major inhaler manufacturers are now slashing the price of inhalers from hundreds of dollars down to just $35 for the millions of Americans who need them. The Commission also recently finalized a rule to ban non-compete clauses, which prevent 1 in every 5 Americans from freely taking jobs and starting their own businesses. Our rule would raise workers' wages and restore their economic liberty while also creating thousands of new businesses and spurring innovation. We have received a tremendous public response to this effort, including more than 26,000 comments from everyday Americans. Over the last year, I've had the great privilege of traveling across the country to hear from people from all walks of life share how unchecked corporate power can undermine their core economic liberties. I've learned from family farmers in Iowa, gig drivers in New York, community pharmacists in Philadelphia, grocery workers in Phoenix, and tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. They all came from different backgrounds and political persuasions, but they all had the same goal: to do an honest day's work on a level playing field with the freedom to succeed on the merits of their talent and efforts. I'm incredibly proud of the FTC's work to help make good on that fundamental promise of America to its citizens, particularly when we face down deep-pocketed opponents who can wield near infinite resources against us. Unfortunately, the FTC's enacted budget for FY 2024 of $425 million represented a 1% reduction from the previous year. The effect of this reduction, alongside a statutorily mandated 5% pay raise and higher non-pay costs resulting from inflation, means significantly less to support the FTC's mission. To support our efforts in FY 2025, the Commission is requesting $535 million and 1443 FTE, an increase of $109 million and 55 FTE. This adjustment would fund mandatory pay increases and anticipated increases for FY 2025, as well as other inflationary non-pay expenses, and critical IT investments that we need to maintain our enforcement work. Our economy has evolved tremendously since Congress created the FTC more than a century ago. From Teddy Roosevelt to FDR, our leaders have long recognized that safeguarding economic liberty requires checking private monopolies. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chair Khan. We'll now begin questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask their question. Ask you to engage in 5 minutes. Watch the yellow light. We'll tell you there's 1 minute left and start to wrap up from there. First, I'll recognize myself. Chair Khan, on April 23rd, the FTC issued a final rule that essentially prohibits and eliminates all non-compete agreements. Well, I agree that there are many and were many businesses who use non-compete agreements in a way that wrongfully harmed employees and stifled competition and growth. Not all non-compete agreements are created equally. Under what statutory authority did the FTC issue the final rule prohibiting non-compete agreements and essentially nullify such contracts between employees and employers across the country?
So the FTC promulgated this rule under Section 6G of the FTC Act, which says that the FTC can issue rules as part of its work. Section 5 of the FTC Act prohibits unfair methods of competition, and the FTC has determined that non-compete clauses constitute unfair methods of competition, and so that was the authority that we did this under.
Would you agree that the rule carries economic and political significance? And if so, is this rulemaking not subject to the major questions doctrine?
Congressman, we followed some of those developments in the Supreme Court quite closely, and in our final rule, we lay out why we do not believe that this runs into the major questions doctrine. I'll say, just stepping back, as we undertook this work, we weren't confident on the front end what necessarily the scope of this rule should be, but it was because we ended up receiving 26,000 comments from people across our economy, across our country, from bartenders and janitors who've had non-competes vigorously enforced against them, to small businesses and entrepreneurs who shared with us how non-competes have prevented them from launching their new businesses and contributing to economic growth. And so we concluded that this was the right place to land.
Fair enough. Last year, we had a little dialogue about the CARS rule. I mentioned in my opening statement, it is my understanding that the FTC has decided to delay the implementation of that rule while a legal challenge against it is pending. It seems to me that this rule was misguided and clearly burdensome from the beginning. Instead of delaying the effective date, why not just withdraw the rule?
Thanks for the question. So just to step back, the CARS rule is pretty simple. It basically prohibits auto dealers from lying to car buyers about costs and prices. So the rule says you can't engage in bait and switch tactics, and you can't impose junk fees. So, charge people for, say, nitrogen-filled tires when really the tires just have regular air. So these are pretty simple principles. And the reason we did this is because despite a decade of enforcement, the complaints about deception at the auto dealer have not gone down significantly. We know that buying a car is one of the most expensive purchases that a lot of Americans make, and we need to protect them. A lot of the complaints we've gotten have actually been from service members. And so members of our military who require buying a car to navigate the sprawling bases have been especially subject to these predatory deceptive tactics. And so we felt an enormous urgency to do this work.
Thank you. Mr. Hoyer?
Thank you very much. Turn on your mic, Hoyer. Thank you very much. You point out that 1 in 5 Americans are subject to a non-compete rule.
That's right.
So that's 20% of the American workforce.
That's right.
And your point is, which I take, is that having such a broad spread non-compete rule stifles competition.
That's right.
Raises prices, and prevents people from using their own ingenuity in perhaps another way, notwithstanding the fact they're at a very or relatively low level of employee. Is that accurate, all of that?
All of that's accurate, Congressman.
It seems to me in that respect, we all understand that there are certain non-compete agreements that are legitimate. You you learn, if you work in a big plant and you learn technology and you get experience, et cetera, and you find out competitive skills and processes that are used in that company, that they don't want you taking it someplace else to compete against them. That seems to me to be a legitimate use, but to be used, you made a very low-level analogy in your opening statement, to prevent a worker from either going into business themselves or improving their salaries and working conditions seems to me clearly an objective that is within your responsibility and very good for the American people. That's not a question, it's an observation. I have raised, Mr. Womack also raised with the IRS commissioner, the companies that are saying that they can save your tax money if you owe taxes or didn't pay taxes. They can come in and they can make a very good deal, and you don't pay them anything unless they save you money, which means, obviously, other taxpayers are going to pay a little more because some taxpayers pay much less. Have you looked into that at the FTC?
It's on our radar because of engagement with your office, and any time that a company is making certain representations that don't accurately reflect the services they offer, that can be deceptive and is relevant to the FTC.
Can you briefly tell me what you won't be able to do if we do not approve the budget level that you requested that will then in turn harm the American people? And maybe in the process discuss a little more. I made the point, IRS at the higher end, millionaires and above of income, oversight results $1 spent by the IRS in enforcement results in $12 of savings. You used a higher figure. Can you explain that to us?
So for every $1 that the FTC receives, we return $14 in consumer benefits, which is pretty stunning. And the FTC's budget, basically 70% of that covers our people. So the overhead costs beyond that is pretty low as an overall portion. And so when we have, 5% pay increases that are not funded, that hits us hard. And so if we are not able to get funding to fully support our mission, that's going to mean fewer investigations, fewer lawsuits stopping law breaking by data brokers, fewer lawsuits stopping unlawful surveillance of kids, fewer lawsuits stopping illegal practices by healthcare monopolies, fewer actions to cut back on elder fraud or Made in USA fraud or fraud targeting veterans. And so all of this is a core part of the FTC's work, and if we're not adequately funded, it's going to come at the expense of that.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to pursue that further with you in your office. Also, two things, junk fees. The president's made a real point of that. The administration has. There are a lot of junk fees, and people don't know about them and perhaps don't need them, more pointedly. I'd like to look into that further. And also would like to discuss with you more in depth the car rule, because I have some very reputable car dealers who have talked to me about this and indicated this is more make work and doesn't get to a more honest result, which you have opined. So I'm going to look at that further. I don't have time to question you about it in depth, but I do want to look at that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. Chair will now recognize Mrs. DeLauro for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Khan, I wanted to ask you about price gouging in the food market and the FTC's role in alleviating the pressure that families are feeling here. Over the last 4 years, food prices have risen over 25%. That's according to the Consumer Price Index. Large corporations like to blame inflation on supply chain shocks. Report after report shows that the price increases have been driven by large corporations taking advantage of an outsized market to raise prices on the backs of working people. And again, there is no food shortage in the U.S. So FTC released a report finding that large grocery retailers, quote, seem to have used rising costs as an opportunity to further raise prices to increase their profits, which remain elevated today, end quote. I know your agency and the administration have been trying to address the financial pressures consumers are feeling. What actions has the FTC taken to date to rein in high food prices?
So the FTC earlier this year sued to block the Kroger-Albertsons merger because we alleged that that would result in higher prices for American consumers. As you noted, we also have done a study looking at supply chains in the grocery sector and trying to understand both what happened when the supply chains seized up and what's happened now that those stresses have been relieved. What we found was that consolidation and concentration can contribute to severe supply chain disruptions. Because if you concentrate production, if you put all of your eggs in one basket, a single disaster or a single outbreak can lead to all sorts of cascading problems, and the entire supply chain can seize up. And so promoting competition is good for more resilient supply chains. We also found that when these supply shortages hit, big companies were able to get special discounts, special access from big suppliers, and independent grocers got shut out. And so there can be an asymmetric impact where big corporations get out ahead and smaller corporations get left behind. We're also hearing a lot of concerns from independent grocers about some of that discrimination and how it could be leading to higher costs. So all of that is on our radar, and we're scrutinizing it closely.
So, and again, is there a way in which to, you've talked about what's on the radar, USDA and DOJ, working with them to deal with lowering food prices?
Yeah, absolutely. We work with both of them. We also have a lawsuit pending right now taking on practices by the two big pesticides manufacturers. We allege that their anti-competitive practices result in farmers overpaying by billions of dollars, and then farmers inevitably pass on those costs to consumers. So we have a lawsuit pending. We got a great victory at the motion to dismiss stage, and we're hoping if we're successful, that'll contribute to lower food prices as well.
Mm-hmm. Just as we wrote a letter, several of us, to the president. This is action on high food prices, and prohibiting exclusionary contracting by dominant firms in the industry, guidance on potential violations of the Robinson-Patman Act, and Section 5 of FTC Act. Cross-agency collaboration, that really is what you're referring to. So I hope you'll consider all of these options. I look forward to working with you on this issue. It is the biggest concern that the American people have, that they've gone to the grocery store and they're getting priced out. And that shouldn't happen. Let me move to infant formula, where you've done a report that examines some of the factors that led to the nationwide shortage of infant formula in 2022. Concerning for WIC participants who purchased more than half of infant formula in the United States. And that infant formula crisis really demonstrated the fragility and the hyper-consolidation of the U.S. infant formula market. 3 companies controlling upwards of 97% of the market. You mentioned several policy changes at FDA, USDA to improve access to safe infant formula for families in my state and across the country. In addition to the actions taken by FDA and USDA, what additional actions can FTC take to promote competition in the infant formula market? Address WIC, if you can, for a moment. Does that mechanism create large savings for the government, allows WIC to provide more benefits within budget restraints, but do you believe that single supplier contracts will be a long-term problem in addressing the consolidation in the infant formula market?
So there's no doubt that WIC is such an essential program. When we looked at the infant formula market, we did see some suggestions that the current approach to WIC contracting, which are basically the single source contracts, can encourage consolidation and harm competition in ways that locks out some of the smaller formula manufacturers from the market, and also means that if you have a single contamination in a single factory, that can create shortages across the country. And so there's no doubt that, there are benefits from the current approach, but there are also downsides when it comes to creating a more fragile system. And so I think we need to figure out what's a better and more optimal balance there so that we don't have such a fragile market that really hurts American families.
Well, we saw the effect of what happened in the with infant formula, which was an enormous crisis. We shouldn't let that crisis just pass without trying to address some of the issues. What I would love to do is to work with you and to look at how we're going to promote that competition in the market and how, without disrupting the flow of WIC benefits because they are needed, but how we can have a different approach to not further encouraging consolidation. So thank you, and Mr. Chairman, thank you for indulging the additional time. I appreciate it.
I appreciate the question, Ms. DeLauro. Now recognize Mr. Womack for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome Chair Khan to the committee. I know my friend Cindy Hoyer is going to talk a little bit more about cars. The cars rule, we'll dig into that too a little bit. And in your opening comments, you talked about the work that you've done on robocalls, on unwanted telephone traffic coming into the homes of everyday Americans. And congratulations on that, but you haven't fixed the problem, right?
That's right. We have seen a significant drop in complaints, but obviously, robocalls are still a scourge. There's
Is
no
it
doubt.
possible that the reason you don't have as many complaints is people have just given up?
It's possible. I mean, we have been.
I think it's
undertaking-
probable. Because I used to hear a lot from people, and in conversations, I still get comments. They're still getting this. So I would, on one hand, I would congratulate you for bringing the enforcement actions that you've brought on people performing this unwanted service into America's homes. But the problem is not fixed, and we still get a lot of concerns about that. So I'd be careful not to make that your calling card. You're asking for a 25% increase over the enacted 24 level, from 425 and change to 535. In just a few seconds, because I got a limited amount of time, what's the justification there?
So the justification is that there are unfunded pay increases. There are higher costs we face because of inflation unrelated to pay. And then we also have to make critical investments.
25%?
We also have to make critical investments in some of our tech upgrades. Sometimes, we now have to analyze huge amounts of data. Right now, we don't always have the capacity to analyze that data in-house. We also need to do modernization of our complaint database, and so all of those costs are included. Again, 70% of the FTC's budget is our people, and so those pay increases, especially when they're not funded, do hit pretty hard.
Fair enough. We'll have a lot more debate about the size of that increase. To another line of questioning, before you were confirmed in 21, your background was in academia, where you've argued in support of dramatically expanding the FTC's regulatory and enforcement powers. From being the only regulator to challenge the merger of two luxury fashion firms, Tapestry and Capri, to blocking Illumina's acquisition of cancer startup Grail, it's clear to us that you continue to hold this view by blocking countless mergers. Are there any mergers that are good for the economy, in your view?
So 98% of all mergers go through without even a second question being asked by the government. It's 2%.
That's because you don't have enough staff to come after them, right? Is that the problem?
Look, there are a whole bunch of mergers that pose legal issues, and we have an obligation to protect the American people from illegal consolidation. That's the job Congress has given us, and we do that job without fear or favor. One of the transactions you mentioned, the Illumina-Grail merger, that was unanimously voted out before I arrived. The commission unanimously issued an opinion believing that deal was illegal, and we got a resounding win in the Fifth Circuit last year, saying that the FTC was right. This was an anti-competitive deal. So I think we're getting it right.
Well, it's often been said that a broken clock is right twice a day. And so I'm not going to dispute the fact that there are things that the FTC is doing
that strike the right balance. I think the challenge for us is where is there too much government? I mean, you talked about you gave the example on cars, nitrogen-filled tires versus regular air tires. Do we need the government to tell us that? Is that what the purpose of government is? I struggle with too much government. As a matter of fact, academia has reported that because of your background, that you've openly admitted, in someone's words, preferring to err on the side of overly aggressive enforcement rather than too passive enforcement. Do you admit to that?
Well, Congressman, I do think that over the last 40 years, we've seen huge amounts of consolidation that has resulted in a more centralized economy, right? I mean, one of the contributors of America's economic success has been open, competitive markets and free enterprise. And if we allow too much centralization, that's going to set us back. And so I believe, and Congress has charged the FTC with vigorously enforcing the antitrust laws to ensure we have free enterprise and fair competition, and that's what we do.
Well, we'll hold some of these questions for a little bit later, but suffice it to say, the challenge for the members of this committee, given the pressure on the discretionary budget of the U.S. government, is to how much of this government can we actually afford, and where is there too much government? And that debate, I think, is still alive and well. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Womack. We will now recognize Mr. Molinar for any questions he may have.
Chair Khan, thank you for being with us today. My understanding is you're supportive of EU digital economy policies like the Digital Markets Act. You've used taxpayer dollars to support and assist in the implementation of European law against American companies by sending staff to Brussels. And as you may know, European policy compels the forced sharing of intellectual property and proprietary data that only makes U.S. companies weaker and advantages Chinese firms. Have you considered how the European laws that you support provide an advantage to Chinese competitors and undermine U.S. competitiveness in European markets?
Congressman, I'm focused on enforcement of the U.S. antitrust and consumer protection laws, and we hear a lot of concern about how allowing too much consolidation, allowing unchecked monopoly power is what could risk America falling behind, since entrepreneurship and innovation is what's allowed us to get ahead from having strong free markets, and so that's what the antitrust laws are about.
But do you agree that you sent staff to Brussels to assist with the implementation of the Digital Markets Act?
So I was fortunate to inherit a really vibrant international office at the FTC that was launched during the Bush administration. There are also various agreements that would enter during the Bush administration that allow for and invite cross-border cooperation. The business community has actually been a big vociferous supporter of greater harmonization across the globe. And so that's work that's been long preceding me, and it's been continuing since I joined.
Do you agree with Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo when the DMA was being crafted? She said that we have serious concerns that these proposals will disproportionately impact U.S.-based tech firms and their ability to adequately serve EU customers and uphold security and privacy standards?
Look, each jurisdiction has the prerogative of passing its own laws. I'm focused on the U.S. antitrust laws. I know there's been significant discussion in Congress about the outsized power of some of the tech giants and how that can result in censorship, in undermining people's economic liberties, and how that can undermine entrepreneurship. And so it'll be interesting to see where in the U.S. we end up with that as well.
Okay, it's my understanding, though, that late last year your team was working on a federal register notice that would help assess the ways in which Europe's digital agenda was helping Chinese companies. This includes potential disclosure of source code and IP, forced transfer of data, and increasing security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Chinese actors. Why has this effort not moved forward?
I'm not familiar with that Federal Register notice, but we're happy to take a look and get back to you.
So your team was not working on a Federal Register notice?
Not that I'm aware.
Okay. But would you agree that there are serious national security concerns associated with that?
With what specifically?
Well, the idea that we're going to empower Chinese companies and requiring the forced disclosure of source code and IP of American companies.
I'd want to take a closer look at the specifics before answering, but happy to take a question for the record on that.
Okay. Are you aware that China is actively pursuing digital negotiations with some of our key trading partners, such as the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement with New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Chile?
I assume that's true.
You're not familiar with that?
We're not deep in kind of on the front lines of the trade negotiations. We defer to USTR on that.
Okay. But in some areas, you seem to be speaking out on labor, environmental issues where you're pushing for higher standards internationally, but not in this area. You'd be allowing China to set the standards in this digital world. Do you see an inconsistency with that?
The FTC is not weighing in on Chinese trade agreements. There may be other parts of the administration.
No,
that
I'm
they're doing that.
referring to setting standards, international standards. You've been involved setting standards on environmental issues and labor issues, but not on digital ones?
We have not been involved in setting environmental standards. I've been very clear that ESG claims and commitments actually are not relevant to antitrust analysis. They can't rescue illegal deals. So maybe there's a misunderstanding about some of
Well,
the
thank you. I will submit for the record on the questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molnar. We will now recognize Mr. Cartwright for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Chair Joyce. And to our witness, welcome. And let me say on behalf of Americans all over this country and consumers, thank you for your efforts at enforcing the antitrust laws that protect consumers against anti-competitive behavior, against unfair collusion, against an excessive amount of consolidation of American companies. You are following up an American tradition started by Teddy Roosevelt, that great progressive, and I thank you for it. Last week, well, 2 weeks ago, May 2nd, you blew the lid off of an amazing scandal of a Texas oil executive who was caught attempting to collude and conspiring to collude with other Texas oil companies, other American oil companies, and officials at OPEC, the Saudi Arabian and the Middle Eastern conglomeration of oil-producing countries, oil-producing and exporting countries. You caught this man colluding. You caught this man conspiring to collude with other companies, with OPEC, and this was his plan, because oil prices were dropping during the pandemic. He wanted to prop up oil prices by reducing output by American oil producers, reducing output by international oil producers. In fact, according to the FTC's complaint, by the way, you did file a complaint May 2nd, and Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this complaint into the record. This is the public version of the complaint, without objection. In your complaint, you quoted this executive from Texas. He said, if Texas leads the way, maybe we can get OPEC to cut production. Maybe Saudi and Russia will follow. That is our plan. That was in your complaint. Madam Chair, this is not news to Americans. We saw during the pandemic, as price per barrel of oil leveled off, price at the pump per gallon of gas continued to rise and rise and rise. Everybody knew that we were being gouged. Everybody knew that record profits were being scored by the oil companies, the gas companies. Everybody knows that they're continuing to make very handsome profits. And people know that this executive that you singled out, that you caught conspiring with OPEC, is worth over $200 million. It isn't enough that American consumers are struggling to pay their bills, to make ends meet, as prices remain high after the pandemic. And prices are driven by oil prices and gas prices. Everything we buy has oil and gas prices baked in because it has to be delivered. It has to be transported. We knew this. Americans understand about the record profits of the oil companies. And it isn't enough that the gas prices are killing people. It isn't enough that the prices of everything continue to stay high. It isn't enough that these oil companies and multimillionaires and billionaires are still enjoying the fruits of the tax cuts they got in 2017. None of that's enough. Now they have to conspire with OPEC and with other oil companies to keep prices high at the pump by limiting production. What I want to ask you about this complaint is, would you explain to us why that's illegal, what I just described?
So the U.S. antitrust laws prohibit collusion, they prohibit price fixing, they prohibit coordinated output reductions. And so if we find executives publicly signaling, or as we found here as well, privately communicating with other executives, or in this case also with OPEC officials from countries like Saudi Arabia, saying effectively, hey, wouldn't it be great if we all collectively cut back production so that prices would stay high and we could pad our profits? That's something that's concerning.
Well, it concerns all of us here. I commend your work. Keep going, Chair Khan. Get after it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that statement, Mr. Cartwright. We now recognize Ms. Hinson for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Hoyer for holding the hearing today. And Chair Khan, I appreciate you coming before us today to talk about the FTC's mission. I want to go back to a topic that several of my colleagues have already brought up, and that's the CARS rule. Back in January, obviously, you issued that. It would exclusively regulate motor vehicle dealers, and according to the commission, the rule is aimed at protecting consumers. But it does specifically exempt purchases of motorcycles, scooters, electric bicycles, and several other types of vehicles, all of which are bought by everyday consumers. And from conversations with my constituents, there remains a little bit of a lack of clarity on this rule, whether or not it applies to heavy-duty trucks, which I think we can all agree are not bought by your everyday consumer. There's a big difference between buying a cement mixer and a minivan that you're going to cart your kids around in, right? I think we can all agree those are two different types of customers. But under one reading of your rule, America's over 3,800 medium and heavy-duty truck dealers, including 92 in my home state of Iowa, would incur all the costs of that new regulation, despite only selling to other businesses and not direct to consumers. So nowhere in this regulation does it mention heavy-duty trucks, how they differ significantly from light-duty vehicles. So was it the FTC's intention to regulate commercial truck dealers who are selling to business customers in this rule?
Let me take that back to our team. There really should not be any confusion about the scope of coverage here. So let us follow up with you to be very clear about that.
Because this rule is absolutely silent. So I would like clarification on whether this applies to the purchase of heavy-duty vehicles specifically, along with, you know, you've got all these other vehicles that you've exempted. There's 7 other types that are exempted in the rule. So I think, while I'm pleased that there's a little pause on it right now, I'd like to see it go away entirely, but at the very, very least, we need clarification because a lot of these businesses are kind of caught in that silence on the rule. So will you commit to me to follow up with clarification on the rule?
Yes, happy to do that. And just so you know, the way that we determined what's covered and what's not is basically based on our record. Where we see complaints, where we've seen persistent issues with deceptive conduct. And so for the types of vehicles that were exempted, that was in part because we didn't have as robust a record. And so I'm happy to follow up with you on this.
Yeah, because as I'm looking at the Federal Register, you know, there is wording here, other commenters, including Vehicle Association commenters, claimed that they should be excluded from coverage, generally contending such dealerships operate differently. So I would argue this is one of those cases, and so we definitely need the clarification there. Another concern for my constituents, and one that I know you and I discussed before, is the telework policy of federal agencies, and that includes the FTC. I think it's critically important that employees who are in charge of regulating American businesses are consistently showing up to work. Can you confirm that the FTC's current policy is for staff to come into the office twice per pay period or the equivalent of once per week?
That's right. The current OPM guidance recommends twice a pay period, and so we're conforming to that.
What is the occupancy rate for FTC facilities right now?
So for headquarters, it's around 22, 23%. Across the federal government, the average for headquarters is around 25%. So we're, just a little below that.
Well, we had the IRS commissioner in here last week, and I thought 50% was bad, and I'd like to see that number go higher, because as you're looking at the raises that you're asking for people, $30 million in increase to support salaries at the commission, do you believe that that's a good value for taxpayers when those folks are not in the office? Does it have a bottom line effect on the quality of work that people are doing if they're not in the office?
So I think that's an important question. So far, we haven't seen any compromise of productivity. In fact, productivity is sky high. People are working around the clock. I know we owe you all a report on our telework policies and how that's affecting productivity and recruitment and retention, and so we'll be happy to get that back to you. But honestly, so far, productivity has been off the charts.
What are your metrics for measuring that?
So we look at a range of metrics, including how much money we're getting back to people, including how many investigations we're doing, how many lawsuits we're filing. For me, a big priority has been, let's not just, focus on net number of lawsuits, but let's make sure each of these lawsuits is actually effective. And so we're going after bigger players whose practices affect more Americans. We're looking upstream to make sure we're targeting the root culprits rather than just playing whack-a-mole. And so by all of those metrics, we're having an impact, right? And we hear businesses, including in the M&A space, note that we are achieving deterrence. Illegal deals are not being proposed. And from an enforcement perspective, that's a good thing.
Well, I'll just close, Mr. Chairman, by saying that as I was flying out the other day, I was approached by a Cedar Rapids a police officer at the airport who was complaining about federal government employees not showing up to work when they have to be on the job to do that. So I think that we need to get that number up. We'd like to see a good return on investment for taxpayers, and I think that means showing up to the office if we're paying for those buildings as well. So thank you, Chairwoman, and I look forward to following up. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Ms. Henson. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pocan for any questions he may have.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chair Khan, for being here. I really appreciate the work that you and your agency are doing on behalf of my constituents, saving them from price gouging. I just did a bunch of town halls over the last 4 to 8 weeks, and one of the biggest things that kept coming up is the cost of living still is very elevated, specifically in 2 areas, gas prices and food. I want to piggyback on what Mr. Cartwright said. I just did a little napkin math. I'm a small business owner for 37 years, do a lot of napkin math. But just if it was 40 to 60 cents a gallon, we're paying more because of this collusion. For the average person filling their tank, that's $8 or $10 a week. That's $500 a year of added cost. Times that by half of the people in my district, assuming who have a car, that's $175 million a year just to people in my district. Times 435 districts, that's $7.6 billion, billion with a B, that we're being gouged because of someone like this who's trying to price collude with, quite honestly, foreign companies on oil. And all I can say is if $30 million is the increase to have qualified staff just in one area to save taxpayers $7.6 billion, I think that's a pretty good investment. I would say, though, I looked at what you're doing, they can't be on the board for a while, what we're doing to this oil exec. But honestly, if you commit theft, the average sentence in Wisconsin, or in the United States is 23 months. $7.6 billion is more than grand larceny theft, right? What else can we do to these oil companies that are ripping us off?
So price fixing and output reduction in a coordinated way can be criminal violations of the antitrust laws. As enforcers, we can't specifically speak to, what we're referring and what we're not, but as a general matter, it's been a priority of mine to make sure we are referring more criminal candidates to the Justice Department, because we need to make sure that companies and executives aren't just treating fines as a cost of doing business, and that they take seriously the rule of law.
Well, I would recommend orange is the new black. If we need to make a point, it would be helpful because we're feeling it at the pumps, and clearly this kind of behavior we know isn't isolated. Let me talk about grocery prices too. Looking at some of the stats that you all provided to us, it's pretty startling. 4 food companies control more than 60% of the sales in some grocery categories. You look at their profits, the fact that corporate profits accounted for more than 50% of food prices increases between 2020 and 21, far more than 11% of increases in 4 decades prior. So look, I understand, I'm a small business owner, 37 years. We had increased prices when everything opened up post-COVID, but companies are keeping those prices artificially high and again, ripping off my constituents on things at groceries. And when you look at the profits, I saw you also provided that the increased profits 6% over total cost in 2021, higher than their peak in 2015. And right now, first 3 quarters of 2023, they're over 7%. So what can we do about this? You mentioned some of the mergers of supply chains and others, but what else can we do? Because this is something that average person in Wisconsin is feeling on a real weekly basis, just like getting ripped off on gas by big oil. What can we do about big food?
So the FTC does not have authority to go after just unilateral price hikes and price gouging unless it's connected to some type of coordinated scheme or collusion or anti-competitive conduct. So we are a bit limited. We are stepping back and understanding, how did these markets get so consolidated in the first place? What can we do to make sure the problem, A, doesn't get worse, but B, if we are starting to see anti-competitive conduct in the supply chain, that we're going after that. And so the lawsuit against the 2 pesticide giants is part of that. We have other investigations underway. I know our partners at the Antitrust Division are scrutinizing this as well.
Great. Anything you can do in this area? I mean, high costs are clearly, I think, coming from corporate price gouging right now in 2 main areas of gasoline and food, and I know my constituents will appreciate it. Finally, right now, chemo drugs, I know you've done some work in this area. Can you just talk a little bit about it? We're hearing a lot about shortages on drugs, particularly in chemo. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of concerns. I mean, I meet regularly with market participants in healthcare, including doctors, and they've shared just some horror stories about not being able to provide their patients chemo, even just basic antibiotics because of some of these shortages. We've heard a lot of concerns about these middlemen called the GPOs, the group purchasing organizations, and how these opaque middlemen may be contributing to the problem of shortages. And so we're working closely with the FDA to try to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, anything in this area would be much appreciated. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carl for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Chairwoman Khan. I appreciate you being here. As someone that has owned several pharmacies, I would highly encourage you to look into those organizations. They truly are driving prices up across this nation in untold amounts. And as a small pharmacy owner, it is hard to compete with that. So I encourage you to do that. And my friends that are pouncing on the petroleum industry, I'd like to do a little quick rebuttal on that. I think our fuel prices really started up when Biden took office and shut down a pipeline. That's where it truly started. And it's been, excuse me, is it your time or my time? Thank you. And it truly has reflected, it's been a domino effect in this country, and it will remain to be that way. I am a staunch advocate for our environment. I've always been that way, but the way we're treating these things these days, it's really become a problem. As someone that has started, I don't know, one of these days I'm gonna stop and do the addition, but 10 or more companies, we'll leave it at that. And I've employed hundreds of people by myself as an independent. I've never seen a regulation that helped me as a small business. So I know you feel like regulations help, but in true fact, they hamper the small businesses. They may They may help us with the large corporations, but it does trickle down into the small businesses' pockets. So please keep that in mind. I think you've truly got your heart in the right place, and you're trying to do the best job you can with what you have to work with. I don't have a Harvard or Yale or University of Alabama education, but I do have an education in hard knocks and 35 plus years of business for myself. With that said, my question is this. The FTC has proposed a rule, so-called junk fee, that would require all businesses, including state-regulated finance companies, to provide new disclosures. Chairwoman Khan, for companies that are already complying with this Federal Truth in Lending Act, which I hope you agree offers a robust disclosure for consumers, and which is also already requiring much of the information that the FTC is seeking to have displayed through your junk fee rules. In order to limit customer confusion and costs on businesses to comply with the essential two similar rules, will the FTC exempt lenders who are already complying with the Truth in Lender Act from your junk fee?
So Congressman, the problem that the junk fees proposal is designed to address is deceptive fees. So if you're going online and looking to buy a concert ticket and it's for $34, but when you go to check out, all of a sudden there's this $17.99 facility fee or service fee, you can't escape that fee. You don't really know what you're paying for. Those are the types of pain points that we're trying to solve for. We've heard a lot of complaints from consumers about these, but we've actually also heard concerns from honest businesses who say, we want to be honest with our customers, but when there are deceptive players in the market that are able to get away with deceptive pricing and advertise one price that lures people, but then quietly and sneakily on the back end add all sorts of junk fees, that's not an honest market. And so we think this would help consumers, but also honest businesses.
But again, you're passing more regulations down to a group that's already doing what you're asking them to do twice now. That's what I'm getting at, your regulations. So are you willing to drop the Federal Truth in Lending Act? I mean, you can't, we're going to ask them to do it twice?
So far it's a proposal. We haven't made final decisions about who's in and who's out, but if anybody's complying with a final rule, that should be sufficient. And if there are other rules that complying with them achieves the same goals as what the junk fees rule is achieving, I would imagine that that's sufficient. But happy to take a closer look at some of these issues.
Please do. Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carl. Chair would ask that members refrain from making any noises. Mr. Bishop, any questions you may ask?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Khan, for appearing this morning, and thank you so much for the work that your agency is undertaking on behalf of consumers and the American people. I've got three areas I'd like to touch on briefly. I've been hearing from my constituents many complaints about the practices of pharmacy benefit managers, which they say are driving up the prices of drugs while making it harder for small independent pharmacies like those my friend on the other end of the aisle referred to, particularly in rural areas where pharmacies are fewer and farther between. Over the past couple of decades, FTC has allowed certain vertical integrations within healthcare, leaving only a few companies that not only own PBMs, but also own pharmacies and other healthcare facilities. These companies have become big and powerful, and they often threaten small independents with contract termination if they don't conform to the reimbursement models and the rules that they set forth. 2 years ago, the FTC announced that it would look into this industry and the impact of vertically integrated pharmacy benefit managers on the access and affordability of prescription drugs. Can you let us know the status of the inquiry and whether or not you have sufficient resources to address what appears to be a pretty big issue for the affordability of prescription drugs? Secondly, I'd like to ask if you would address briefly the non-compete agreements. I want to commend you for your work on addressing the pitfalls of non-compete agreements. And I've heard stories of how non-competes can have devastating unintended consequences. I've met with a physician in my district who's barred from practicing in a very rural and impoverished county in my district due to a non-compete with a hospital that doesn't even serve his county. Your agency's new non-compete rule will help not just employees, but also the communities that they serve. So can you highlight for us possible benefits to the non-compete rule? Can you describe what the agency's done to ensure that the rule survives legal challenges? And just in case you have any time left, would you, in addition to the complaint described by Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Pocan with criminal referrals, how the FTC has used its authority to help lower prices for consumers?
Yeah, happy to touch on all of those, Congressman. So I've heard a ton of complaints from pharmacies and independent pharmacists about how it's increasingly difficult for them to stay afloat, not because their communities don't benefit from them or really cherish them, but because they say they're getting squeezed by some of the practices of the pharmacy benefit managers. And that's why we launched that market inquiry. Making progress on that has been a top priority. I wish it had moved even more quickly. I get emails week after week from pharmacists across the country just sharing how dire the situation is right now. And we need to make sure that independent pharmacies are not getting pushed out of the market because of any illegal business practices by major players in the supply chain. And so this remains a big area of focus for us. Our team is small because our agency is small, but we are prioritizing it, and additional resources would let us do this type of work even more quickly. We've heard concerns about and are looking at both the ways that the potential rebates between the PBMs and the drug manufacturers could either be inflating drug prices or depriving Americans of access to lower cost alternatives to the high price brands. And then again, we're also looking at the pharmacy facing side and whether the vertical integration is enabling or incentivizing certain practices that could be systematically disfavoring and squeezing the independents. On non-competes, we also heard a lot of concern from healthcare workers, and some of them shared exactly what you just shared, which is that especially in rural communities, if you're governed by a non-compete, switching employers often means leaving the state and abandoning your patients. And in this way, non-competes could actually be contributing to some of the crises that communities face and not having enough healthcare workers locally. And so we absolutely hope that eliminating these non-competes will allow people to move more freely between employers, which will be good for them, but also will be good for patients and the communities that they serve. So, the rule has been challenged in court. We have a terrific team working to defend that rule because we think we're squarely within our legal authority. And this is exactly why Congress created the FTC, to prevent these types of unfair methods of competition.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Mr. Sanford. And Chair will now recognize Mr. Edwards for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Khan, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon or this morning. I've lost all track now. I'm quite honestly shocked that there is any government agency out there right now asking for a 25% increase in their budget from last year. Just plain and simple, this government cannot afford it. We're approaching any day now $35 trillion in debt. The challenge to this committee is how can we lean on, work with our agencies to do more with less. The taxpayers just can't continue to grow government at this rate. Not only are you asking for a 25% increase from over last year, since 2021, this would represent a 52% increase. I can tell you and any other agency head out there right now that the guy down here on the end of this table is not going to support government growth at that rate. And so let's be thinking about, and I've got a couple of questions to hopefully challenge you on how we can get by without such a drastic increase. Let's start with the 55 people that you intend to hire. Can you give us a little bit of insight on why you need 55 more people to do the same job that was done last year and the year before and the year before?
So just to put the FTC size in context, we are smaller than we were in the 1980s by around 400 people, even though the size of the American economy has grown by at least 6 times over. And so we are having to do way, way, way more with fewer people. We have a really fantastic team and we punch above our weight, but there is no doubt that we are not fully and faithfully going after all of the law violations in our economy. Even with the mergers that come in, I mean, we have to triage. There are ones that look problematic. With the 55 FTEs in particular, that would help support our mission. This past year, we were able to launch a new Office of Technology, bringing on technologists in-house, because as we see surveillance and other types of tactics by these digital monopolies.
And so I apologize for cutting you off. I think you've answered the gist of my question, but you raise another real good point. And the reason I've got to be blunt here and cut you off is the chairman's going to cut me off here in just a minute. So you referenced technology. How have you looked at how you can use that new investment in technology to reduce the number of people that are required?
So the work that we do requires a lot of investigation, legal work, economists. We are certainly hoping to incorporate more of these technological advances within our work, but we are not at a place where we can, let people go and have AI writing the complaints. I know some lawyers have tried out there, and it hasn't gone so well.
Again, with all due respect, I've got a couple more questions I'd like to try to get to. I'd encourage you to figure out how we can use technology to do the same job with less folks. Next question. In a December 2023 Office of Inspector General audit, the Inspector General found that the FTC had not yet refined a complete structured program-level process for invoice review and approval and payment of high-risk contracts. In response to the report, the FTC planned action to work with the Acquisition Office. Can you give us an update? And that report was due by March 30th of this year. Can you give us an update on the Commission's new process?
So anytime the OIG flags certain areas that require improvements, we take that extraordinarily seriously. Since we got that recommendation from the OIG, we've been working closely to put those process improvements in place. And I believe we've kind of checked the box on that, but happy to follow up with you and share more specifics.
I would very much appreciate you updating this committee on what the new process is. And hopefully we'll get a second round of questions. I'll come back, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Now, recognize Mrs. Torrey.
Thank you, Chairman. And good morning, and thank you for being here, Chair Khan. I want to start by thanking you for your very detailed responses and lengthy letters back to my office as I inquired on some very important issues that are critical to my district, dealing with gas prices, gas gouging issues, as well as I can't be only one of 2 women and not ask about an update on the issue that we have been dealing with, critical issue. Companies' unfair data practices that allow extremists in many states to hunt down women seeking health care, from those who are seeking life-saving abortions to those receiving in vitro fertilization and other fertility treatments. Examples like Brittany Watts in Ohio, who was criminally charged last year for her miscarriage. Amanda Zawoski in Texas suffered a devastating pregnancy loss and laid in septic shock in her hospital bed, denied an abortion. Ashley Brandt in Texas was told that if she did not abort one fetus, neither of her twin fetus would survive, but that Texas would consider the abortion an illegal procedure. Gabriela Gonzalez from Texas had to go out of state for an abortion, and when she returned, her boyfriend shot and murdered her in the parking lot. If conservative operatives, let alone stalkers and abusive partners, have access to a woman's data, where she goes, where they can track her, where they can know if she Googled abortion, know if she went to an abortion clinic, and know if she missed a period through an app. This is the world, the reality of the world that we are living in. And I wrote you a letter on this, and thank you again for the response. Can you give me an update on your announcement that you were exploring new rules to address this issue?
Congresswoman, there's no doubt that invasive surveillance threatens core liberties. That's why we have the Fourth Amendment. And I think as we've seen the expansion of more and more of these invasive tracking tools, we're certainly living in a new environment where we need to absolutely crack down on any illegal collection or tracking of people's data, especially when it involves their sensitive data. And so the FTC has current litigation ongoing against a data broker that had been selling people's sensitive geolocation data that was revealing if people are seeking certain health care, if people are going to church, if people are going to
This is an
addiction
American
facilities.
company selling
That's right.
private data.
Yeah. and
Not
we've-
just a Chinese company, but an American company.
An American company. We have also seen American companies selling data to Chinese entities, so that we do see some of those national security concerns as well. So the FTC has been extraordinarily active on the law enforcement front here. As you mentioned, we've also been exploring some rulemaking. We got thousands of comments back, and so our team's been digesting and seeing what more we can do there. But it's pretty clear that the market signal has been sent that we are cracking down on illegal data practices by these data brokers.
Thank you. In 2021, the Supreme Court significantly limited the Federal Trade Commission's ability to seek monetary redress for consumers, relief that the FTC had successfully obtained for over 4 decades. This means that the FTC has been unable to get Americans their money back, a profound effect on consumers and honest businesses. In the last Congress, I joined my colleagues in voting on a fix for this problem. Unfortunately, that legislation did not become law. I wrote you a letter on this issue also. How can the FTC and the American consumers, they have been impacted by this Supreme Court decision, and what can we do to help you, aside from continuing to try to pass this law?
Yeah, and I really appreciate your support for that legislation. I mean, what this basically means is that lawbreakers can profit from lawbreaking, right? And if you want to be an effective law enforcer, you have to make sure that if people are getting cheated out of their money through illegal tactics, they're able to get that money back. So the loss of that authority through that Supreme Court decision was a big setback. The FTC has been using other statutory authorities. This is also why we have been codifying so many rules, because for rule violations, we can get redress and we can get civil penalties. And so that can help with the deterrence, but there's no doubt that actually getting that authority restored is absolutely paramount.
Thank you, and thank you for your response. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and your office and to try to move your office out of the 1980s status when it comes to your budget. Thank you.
Thank you.
In discussing this matter with my ranking member, there's some who would like a second round. He indicates that he'd like to, but he's also has something on his calendar. So why don't we engage in the second round? And if in doing so, let the ranking member go first if he has any questions he has. Okay. I'd like to follow up a little bit on the merger question that took place earlier between both the ranking member and my friend, Mr. Womack. Stepping into the role of chair at FTC, how many mergers have you brought to court, and how does that compare with some of your predecessors?
So we've been very active on the merger front. We've achieved over 19 abandonments, and I think in total we've brought over 60 merger enforcement actions. I think, the FY22 numbers were the highest we've had in close to 2 decades in terms of number of enforcement actions.
And how does that compare with your predecessors?
So it's been the highest number of enforcement actions since at least 2001 on the merger front.
Do you worry about the chilling effect you have on healthy mergers and acquisitions in doing this? And would you agree that like all mergers are not anti-competitive?
It's certainly true that, there are a whole set of deals that we review that we don't challenge because we don't find legal issues, and those ended up going through. As a general matter, I think we had been living in an environment where we had too little deterrence. And so there were deals being proposed that were flagrantly anti-competitive. The agencies were having to spend an enormous amount of taxpayer resources blocking those deals. And so an environment where deal makers are saying, 5 years ago when we were thinking about deals, we didn't really think about antitrust risk, but now it's the first part of the conversation. As a law enforcer, that's good, that's healthy, and we think that's ultimately going to be good for taxpayers as well.
Fair enough. Shifting gears to the your budget request, you asked for obviously an additional 25%. Could you walk us through what enforcement and rulemaking activities are planned if you were to receive this full budget request?
So we're primarily going to be continuing with the rulemakings that we currently have underway, the enforcement actions that we have underway. Antitrust enforcement in particular is very expensive, whereas consumer protection enforcement takes anywhere from 2 to 5 people to bring a particular case. Our antitrust cases sometimes require up to 20 people, even more than that during active litigations. Antitrust litigation has also become extraordinarily expensive because we have to use economic experts. And so these experts routinely are charging millions of dollars. And so as we've become more active on the antitrust side, those expenses have gone up as well.
I understand. Can I take it, Ranking Member Hoyer? No question.
Let me follow up
Sure.
on that if I can. In dealing with the Defense Department a couple of decades ago, I think, a number of 4-stars made the point that we had, in effect, outsourced so much of our internal expertise on what we were buying and whether specifications were being followed that we really couldn't determine. Now, it seems to me when we have to spend millions because we don't have enough federal employees to look at things, that we are, getting overcharged in terms of services that we could perform internally. Do you think that has any relevance in the case that you're talking about, or would it be just too expensive to hire the kind of talent that are necessary and therefore use expertise outside from time to time when needed?
As a general matter, if we had more in-house capacity, we would probably be able to do some of that work in-house. There has been a trend in antitrust litigation for there to be this ratcheting up arms race of each side just having to get more and more experts, more and more expensive experts. Interestingly, we have more and more antitrust judges saying, I heard both of your smart experts and they just canceled each other out. And so there's a question about why we're spending so much money on these experts if they're not actually helping judges as part of their analysis. That's probably an issue that would be fixed, through antitrust reforms to the legislation to cut back on just how some of this analysis is done and rely more on presumptions and per se rule. That would actually make enforcement of the antitrust laws much more efficient and be a boon to taxpayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. Now recognize Mr. Womack.
Always love it when my colleagues talk about their back of the envelope, or in this case, Mr. Pocan's napkin math. So I did a little napkin math of my own.
Oh, my goodness.
And here are the metrics. Here are the numbers. I just went back to the 2020 election. There were over 335,000 people that voted in my election, so I'm just going to say those are 335,000 drivers in my district. There is easily a dollar difference a gallon in gas between 2020 and where we are today. I filled up just before I came back to Washington, and it was over $3 a gallon, so a dollar difference. Assuming somebody uses 20 gallons a week, and that's just kind of a raw number I throw out there. Some use a lot more, some use a lot less. That's $20 a week, so that's costing my drivers in my district $1,000 a year more just in the purchase of gasoline. And when you multiply that times the 335,000 people that I call my drivers, and I think there's a lot more given the traffic in my district, you know, that's the better part of $350 million a year. That's not chump change. But I find it interesting that we're lauding the effort of the FTC in trying to reduce the price of gasoline. Chair Khan, don't you think we just ought to go back to the 2020 policies of the previous administration? I mean, it seemed to be working.
You know, we're focused on what's within the FTC's jurisdiction, which is really about market competition and consumer protection. I leave it to others and to members of the subcommittee.
But based on this back of the envelope math, would you not agree? I mean, the numbers aren't lying. Would you not agree that there's a lot more going on here than just blaming the oil companies for the fact that gasoline is higher? We all agree that we're paying too much for it. We all agree that we're paying too much for groceries. But there's just a lot more to it, and so I would suggest that the people who are too quick to judge based on the efforts right now, the FTC on oil, that there are a lot more input factors, but I couldn't resist the temptation to exercise my iPhone calculator in helping me determine, because I couldn't have done this on my own. I promise you that. Real quickly, one more issue that I wanted to bring up, and that's about the junk fees, and particularly the impact this whole idea on restaurants, because I eat out a lot, and my restaurant owners come and talk to me a lot. The inclusion of restaurants, particularly in small or rural communities, that some of the fees that they charge, surcharges, this sort of thing, called junk fees. Can you explain to me why you included restaurants in this notice?
So in the proposal, we included everybody. We didn't slice and dice and say you're in and you're out, in part because we've had complaints from across the economy, and we didn't want to be accused of kind of arbitrarily excluding some and including others. We did get over 60,000 comments from the public on this, so we're digesting them. And if it turns out that, you know, we have a stronger basis to address junk fees in some areas and not in others, we'll act accordingly. You know, of course, we want to make sure that restaurants and honest restaurants have the chance to compete fairly.
What's the difference between a restaurant and an honest restaurant?
So for the FTC, we look at our businesses being honest in how they're disclosing prices. And a lot of the complaints we hear have been from areas like ticketing and accommodations where, you know, you book a hotel online, you see one price, and then when you go to the hotel, you see all sorts of service fees, resort fees. Again, fees that you don't know what you're really paying for, fees you can't escape, and that ends up inflating costs for people. It means people are paying more. It also means people—
But if it's a delivery fee, or it's customary for people to have fees for large parties, large gatherings in their bigger rooms, would you consider those junk fees?
So if it's a fee that's discretionary and a fee that's actually providing a real service, those are not junk fees.
Okay, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Womack. Chair would now recognize Mr. Cartwright for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. I have a high regard for Chairman Womack, and whether he does his calculations on a napkin or on his iPhone, I have no reason to dispute them. But I do want to give you a chance to weigh in, Chair Khan, about why gas prices were down during the pandemic. Of course, we saw that oil executive complaining about how oil prices were down during the pandemic. Why would something like the COVID pandemic cause prices to go down?
I mean, as we saw, demand fall, that resulted in prices falling.
People were not driving around as much because they were told to stay home and not get sick.
That's right. And I would say more generally, what's been pretty striking about the last few years is for decades, OPEC and OPEC Plus have controlled global oil prices. But over the last few years, we've seen American producers be able to get a lot of oil to market, and that's allowed America to be a competitive check on OPEC and OPEC Plus and not be as much at the whims of what those producers do. That's why when you see messages and communications suggesting that instead of vigorously competing, some of these oil executives were instead trying to coordinate or collude, that's why that's troubling, is because these
It's
producers...
incredibly troubling, and I thank you for addressing it. I want to switch gears. The other thing Mr. Womack talked about was fraudulent phone calls coming into homes. In 2022, seniors were scammed out of $186 million by fraudsters impersonating government officials, many of whom were impersonating workers in the Social Security Administration. In my district, over 190,000 seniors depend on Social Security to stay alive, and that means 190,000 people are potential targets of this kind of predatory, fraudulent behavior. Now, the FTC has taken up this challenge by finalizing its new government and business impersonation rule, which went into effect last month under your tenure. How will this new rule help protect seniors in my district?
The rule will help protect seniors because it prohibits impersonation of legitimate businesses or of the government. And so we've also heard concerns about people making calls pretending to be IRS agents, saying you owe the American government thousands of dollars, and unless you hand that over, we're going to arrest you. Right? Pretty terrifying claims for unsuspecting people to be getting. Because we finalized the rule, that means that if we find these types of impersonation scams, we'll be able to get the money back for consumers, and also we'll be able to levy civil penalties, which add up pretty quickly and can also deter this illegal behavior in the first place.
Another scam that has come into vogue is the grandparents scam. Fraudsters prey on elderly grandparents' love of their grandchildren by pretending to ask for money immediately needed by a grandchild, and they fall into that. Last year, elderly parents and grandparents lost $2.3 million to grandparents' scams. Is there a way to expand this new rule, this FTC government and business impersonation rule, to ensure protection and financial relief from victims of grandparents' scams?
And these grandparent scams are now even more on the rise because of voice cloning technology, where people can actually mimic the precise voice of the grandkid. And we're already seeing an uptick in our complaint database of the voice cloning fraud. So we have actually proposed an expansion of the impersonation rule that would also cover impersonation of individuals. And that would, again, allow us to go after these individual impersonators, charge them with civil penalties.
And that expansion will go through the normal rulemaking
notice and
procedures.
comment. Yes, exactly. We're currently collecting comments. We've also been trying to invite from the public ideas for how can we detect in real time whether a voice on the phone is a real voice or a voice clone. And we just announced some winners of that competition and are hoping to get those ideas out in the market to make sure we can enforce the law more effectively and people can help police some of those as well.
Thank you for protecting our seniors. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Now recognize Ms. Henson for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Chairman Joyce. A recent FOIA request by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce revealed that FTC staff were heavily involved in correspondence with the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, ultimately leading to broad departures from bipartisan support for domestic digital trade rules that protect U.S. exports. So, Mr. Chairman, I would request unanimous consent to insert this FOIA document into the record? Thank you, Mr. Chair. The FOIA does appear to be heavily redacted, as you can see here, providing very little transparency into the decision-making process that resulted in the USTR abandoning rules that protect $626 billion worth of digitally enabled exports that the United States generates in just a year. So, Chairwoman, my question is, did you or your staff specifically instruct the U.S. trade rep to abandon these long-standing bipartisan digital trade rules?
The short answer is no. We at the FTC were not involved in that decision-making.
What specific provisions in these longstanding agreements and rules did the FTC object to? Because obviously with this, we can't tell.
So the FTC was not involved in that specific decision. We do get asked by the trade representative to weigh in when there are questions relating to FTC equities. So if there are trade agreements that are going to have competition chapters, consumer protection chapters, privacy chapters, the FTC has a lot of expertise in those areas, and so we bring that expertise to bear on those discussions.
Would you agree there was quite a bit of coordination between your agency and the trade rep, though, based on these emails? It appears that way.
So when the USTR asks for our views on issues relating to competition and privacy and consumer protection, we provide that expertise. I think it's good government for there to be a whole of government approach in that way.
And it appears you were coordinating on statements as well. Have you seen this document of coordinating on statements to the press?
I personally have not. I don't think the FTC was involved in that.
Okay. Well, I'd encourage you to go through this document that I have submitted for the record. Would you commit today to ensuring that the FTC will protect U.S. interests from digital trade rules abroad that do hurt the U.S. economy?
So we're squarely focused on making sure that we allow American businesses to get ahead. And we do that by making sure they're not being muscled out by illegal practices in the marketplace, by monopolies, that if you're an innovator, you're able to bring your product to market rather than get trampled by one of the existing digital giants. So our work is squarely in line with that goal.
Thank you. Thanks for coming today. Thanks. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Henson. Chair would now recognize Ms. Torres for any questions she may have.
Thank you, Chairman. Chair Khan, I know that you have covered this topic extensively, but I cannot let you leave without weighing in on this issue, and that is, it's so important. Your role in protecting people from scams is so important. I hear from many constituents on how they invest their hard-earned dollars in a safe way, only to fall victims to a scam later. One constituent from my home city of Pomona, Wendy, she came to my office because she was the victim of identity theft and was unable to access her hard-earned Social Security benefits as a result. Another constituent, Crystal, from my district, also came to my office this year because she was a victim of fraud and identity theft that caused Bank of America to limit her financial options. Obviously, cheats are preying on these very vulnerable communities. Some of them, English is their second language. If you use a credit card, you can get your money back after a scam. But if you use a debit card or Venmo or Zelle, you don't have any recourse at getting your money back. We know that scams are underreported, often because the victim is afraid or ashamed and just don't want to admit that they fell, for this trick. Can you share with us more about what you are doing specifically to help victims of identity theft?
So we have a robust program in place to help people who've been subject to identity theft, and a pretty significant percentage of the complaints we get are about identity theft. So, we have FTC resources that kind of walk you through what are the steps to be taking. We also send out regular market alerts to put the public on notice about various scams and frauds that are becoming more prevalent. We've seen, for example, that elderly Americans get subject to tech support scams or lottery or prize scams at higher rates. And so, we put them on notice. We also have a program in place to actually be able to reach communities in the languages that are most accessible to them. So we have programming in Spanish. We've actually been expanding our availability so we can do complaint intake in now up to 12 languages. And our teams work closely with local communities, with local media, to make sure that we're putting as many people on alert to know their rights and be aware of some of these frauds.
And what can we do? What can Congress do to help you and your staff spend more resources on this issue?
So I think just generally continuing to support the FTC's mission by resourcing us adequately. I think we're also seeing some claims by companies that they are immune. We see what are known as Section 230 arguments made when we're going after, for example, some of the telemarketing scams. So there was this decision that came down recently suggesting that some of the upstream players that are enabling some of the illegal calls may actually be not reachable under the law. And so Congress clarifying that could be useful.
Great. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Torres. Chair now recognizes Mr. Edwards for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Khan, I have a keen interest in the occupation and leases of our federal buildings. That's why I introduced the Federal Use It or Lose It Leases Act, or the full act. We've had reports that many federal agencies might occupy as little as 17% of their office space. And so I noticed in your budget, you're asking for $32 million for a new office to downsize, and I applaud the effort to downsize. I'm just curious to better understand the rationale and methodology that you use to get to the point that a new building was the answer, particularly because you're suggesting a downsize of the building, yet you're hiring 55 more people. So can you give me just a little bit of an overview to some of the logic and rationale that you used and maybe some of the options that you eliminated in making the decision to ask for $32 million for a brand new shiny building?
Yeah, happy to. So we have two buildings in DC. One is our headquarters building, and then we have a second building that houses, a huge portion of our staff. That lease for that second building is now expired. We've just been in a kind of holdover status. And so we've been working with GSA to figure out, what does it look like to renew this lease? As part of that process, we are requesting less space. It's around a 25% cutback. And GSA has recommended to us that we budget around $32 million just to help navigate that whole process of going through this, releasing and figuring out what's going to happen. But we're definitely in the posture of cutting back on space.
So with other buildings being occupied as much as, or as little as 17%, did you give any consideration to moving into another building and sharing it with an agency that doesn't need all of their space?
So all options are on the table, and I know GSA is thinking expansively and creatively about, especially in the current environment, how do we make sure we're being maximally efficient with our space? And so we're in close contact with GSA, working hand in hand with them to figure out what's the best place to land.
So am I to understand $32 million would build the new building and buy the new site wherever it is that you're going, or is this some installment to a bigger plan?
So that amount is basically designed to cover the relocation and the releasing. It's a number that GSA recommended to us when we told them what some of our spacing needs were. It's not about, creating a new building from scratch. It's about we're expired in our current lease and we need to figure out where do we go from here.
All right, you've effectively confused me. So now you want $32 million to do what?
So GSA, when federal agencies have basically run out the lease on their space, GSA works with them to go through the process again of either renewing that lease, but even if you renew that lease, you have to recompete.
So the $32 million, is it to build a building or to go lease another building?
So it could be basically to get more space, a different space. And GSA recommends that we basically ballpark that amount to make sure that as we have to go through relocation, as we have to, expect to have another space if we don't get this lease again, that's the amount that we should budget for.
And so back to one of my previous questions, the $32 million would get a new lease or build a new building for what period of time? And what might this committee expect to see as a request in the future?
So we're certainly in the posture of cutting back on the space that we need, and we're even figuring out, can we shed that more quickly? Even those gains and savings would not really kick in until the end of FY 2025. These leases can be from, 7 years, 9 years, 10 years, and so we would be following that regular process and figure out, what does the next stage of this look like.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd suggest we, before we appropriate $32 million, we should have a much better understanding of how it would be used. So with that, I yield back. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. I know all good things must come to an end, Chair Khan, but there may be some members here who would like to submit questions for the record. Those that have been, please submit, those members and the members who have been here, please submit their questions for you for review, and I'd ask for 15 business days for your people to respond to those questions. And again, I'd like to thank you for your time here today and your testimony and the work that you do. With that, this hearing is now adjourned.